a dash of Cheers in one of my favourite Friends episodes. Needless to say, the one with Ross's wedding part 1 makes me pretty happy. This is the 23rd episode of the 4th season of Friends. It's directed by Kevin Bright, and as always there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens in this episode and share some thoughts along the way. And it's quite interesting for me because even though I don't like Emily, I'm not a fan of Emily as a character, I've mentioned this before, the 2 wedding episodes I think are 2 of my favourites. That might partly be because they're set in London, and that definitely appeals to me, but there are so many great, iconic moments about these episodes, and I will go through the first part now. And this was my introduction to Cheers. Cheers has a huge place in my heart, and nowadays I prefer Cheers to Friends. And this would have been my introduction to Cheers, but I'll get into that when we get there. It starts off with everybody getting ready. Obviously, Phoebe and Rachel are staying behind, and then off they go to London, and we first see Joey and Chandler touring London, and Joey tries to go into the map, and he's making a video of the trip, which is an absolute delight. Chandler, not quite as enthusiastic. Things are going well, though, for Emily initially. She's very excited about things, and they approach the building where they're meant to be getting married, and it's already in the process of being torn down. And before we have time to process this, we cut back to Phoebe and Rachel. I think, maybe 3 or 4 times throughout, and I think the pacing is really great. The timing of cutting back is always really fantastic, and it really helps to keep the pace of the episode going. And sometimes with 2-parters in sitcoms, they don't need to be 2-parters. This absolutely did. I never felt like they were dragging anything out. I feel like, in fact, I would have maybe liked it to have been even longer, and that's not something I usually say with episodes where we have multiple parts. Technically, to be fair, it does extend beyond 2 parts. I don't want to say too much about that just now, but the bulk of it, of the wedding, is in the 2 parts, and I think the pacing is fantastic. We then cut back, as I said, to Rachel and Phoebe, and Phoebe says to Rachel if someone I was still in love with was getting married, and Rachel kind of snaps her head around and is confused by what Phoebe's just said, and we learn that Rachel didn't even realise she was still in love with Ross. Everybody else knows, apart from Ross, and it does kind of make me wonder, had she known, had they told her that she was still in love with Ross beforehand, would we have even got to this point? I'm glad we got to this point because I love this episode, but it's interesting to think that Rachel wasn't even fully aware of how she was feeling. It's not just that she wasn't willing to admit it, which is pretty interesting. Back in London, we have Richard Branson, who is a souvenir stall vendor. Joey buys this hat. I bought that hat on my very first trip to London in 2010, I think, 2010. I bought that hat. It would have been 2009. And needless to say, I was very, very delighted. In fact, I think one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to visit London when I was younger would have been because of this episode and also the Mary-Kate and Ashley film Winning London. But this is one of my earliest views of London, and then I obviously went on to live in London, so it definitely had a lot of influence over me from a very young age. Monica has apparently suggested to Emily that they postpone the wedding if she can't get married in that building, and if she doesn't think she'll find somewhere within a day to have the wedding. And I think Emily was being unreasonable. Because as Ross pointed out, everybody has travelled far to this, it's cost a lot of money, and it just doesn't make sense to postpone the wedding. And in that moment, Emily was caring more about the building than she was about getting married to Ross. Why would you postpone marrying apparently the love of your life? Postponing it isn't going to mean she can get married in that hall. It's not like postponing it will reconstruct the hall. That's out of the question. Well, in theory. So I think her decision was absolutely terrible. I think Monica's decision or Monica's suggestion was completely unacceptable. And in that moment, it reminded me why I don't like Emily. Because she was more concerned about a building than she was about marrying the love of her life. And I think it was just completely unfair. However, things do turn around, and we'll get to that in a moment. Back with Phoebe and Rachel. Phoebe does try and help Rachel to get over the situation, to try and get over Ross. It involves a little bit of slapping Rachel, which is probably not the most effective technique, but it was pretty interesting. Then we are in the hotel with Chandler and Joey and Monica. We are cutting back and forth a lot, and I think this is one of the reasons why the episode works as multiple parts, or why the story works as multiple parts, because there's so much going on, and there's so much to look at. And I absolutely love it. And then we get to see some of Joey's film that he's recorded on the camcorder. It's him and Fergie. I had no idea who that was for many, many years when I watched this as a child. That was my introduction to Fergie. So the episode has definitely given me an education as a child as well. And Joey then phones Phoebe and Rachel, and he speaks to Phoebe, and then he feels a little bit homesick. And we get the Cheers theme for about 5 seconds, but this was my introduction to Cheers, and I love it. I love it so, so much. Monica then takes Emily to the hall, and there are lights everywhere, and I do have to say it looks absolutely gorgeous. It is really stunning, and I like the fact that Ross has made the effort to try and give Emily the location, the venue of her dreams, as best as he can. And I think in that moment, and this is my interpretation of it, I think Emily agreed quite willingly to marry Ross in that venue with all of the lights, not because it looked beautiful, it did, but I think in that moment she realised that Ross is amazing and he is willing to do anything for her to make her happy, and marrying him is more important than the venue, than where they get married. And I think that's why she so readily agreed to getting married there in its current state, not because of how it looked, but because she realised marrying Ross was more important regardless of where they got married. But that's my reading of it. Maybe if anybody wants to argue that actually she decided to get married there because of how it looked, that's absolutely fair enough. And it does look absolutely stunning. We then have quite a lot happening in a very short space of time. Basically, Rachel is running all over the place and she's going to London. She's got her suitcase. She's rushing, trying to rush out of the door. Phoebe tries to tell her quite harshly. Phoebe says, "It's too late, you've missed your chance." And I feel like Phoebe wasn't being harsh. She was just trying to make Rachel realise that what she's about to do is ludicrous. Because Rachel wants to go to London to tell Ross how she feels just as he's about to get married, which of course is never a good idea. But it's too late to stop her. She's out the door. Phoebe can't exactly chase after her. We end on a little bit of a cliffhanger, but the final scenes are actually Chandler and Joey, and we have video footage of them touring London. It's a nice light-hearted way to end what is otherwise quite a suspenseful episode. It's fantastic. I absolutely adore this episode. It's so strange because I don't really like Emily, but at the same time, Emily's not actually in it a tremendous amount. So maybe that's part of the reason as well. But this absolutely was one of the reasons why I became obsessed with London before I'd even been to London from a very young age. London was very much my dream. And that's before I realised the summers could get up to 40 degrees. Not very pleasant. And my introduction to Cheers as well. This episode will always hold a very special place in my heart. Great variety, great editing, great pacing. Very entertaining, and I'm looking forward to watching the next one. I think the next one is incredibly iconic with some, well, I'll say no more, actually. Some interesting moments. I'll get there when I get there, but for now, the one with Ross's wedding, part 1, is pretty perfect.